begin the event, so I'd like to first introduce myself. My name is Alicia Vandewey. I'm an International Student Advisor for International Student Services at Ryerson University. I'll be moderating the event today. So I'm pleased to welcome Lynn Lavallee. She's a professor at Ryerson, and Mariam Zaidi. She's going to be introducing her film Safar. We're going to be screening it, and then she's going to be answering some questions and answers. Lynn is going to be talking a little bit about Aboriginal history today. We're going to be closing the event with Joanne Dallaire. She's an elder at Ryerson University. She opened Social Justice Week up last Monday. She's going to be closing the event at the end of the event today. You'll notice at the registration table, all of you were given an evaluation sheet. We want to ensure that we're always improving our services for you and that just let you know that your voice does matter. So please fill out the sheet. It's anonymous. You can just leave it at the registration table outside the front door. So with this event, we're talking about a people's history. So especially with new international students who, if they would like to immigrate here and become permanent residency, the one thing that they'll have to do is complete the citizenship test. A major part of that citizenship test deals with Canadian history, but as with a lot of other mainstream history, it's only coming from a certain voice. I find a lot of voices are left out in that history, especially with this weekend being Thanksgiving. There's a lot of issues around that, dealing with Aboriginal people and colonialism that you may not hear in the mainstream media and the mainstream news. So that's what Lynn's going to address. And likewise, when we're recognizing the Aboriginal peoples who first inhabited this land, Canada is a country that's built on immigration. We have a lot of issues with immigration now, with the Conservative government putting strict rules on who can come and who can't. And Mariam Zaidi is going to talk about her personal history, immigrating to Canada and having members of family trying to immigrate to Canada. So it's essentially saying who's fit to come and who's not.
Could I get you to speak a little closer to the microphone?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. And so before we begin, I'm going to introduce, we do have 2 interpreters. So if anyone requires interpreters, they are at the front. We have Bonnie Lynn Barker as well as Kate Lewis. I'm going to introduce Ryerson Hoylett. He's the VP Equity at the Ryerson Students Union, and he's going to give us an opening that recognizes the land that Ryerson currently sits on.
Hello. Sorry. How's everybody doing? Y'all are like so quiet. How's everybody doing? Yeah! So my name is Ryerson. I'm the VP Equity at the Students Union. I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. We're going to have a lot of great discussions. It was a great introduction just now, so I'm not going to jump into it too much. But at the beginning of all of our events, we like to recognize the land that we're on. So as many of us are settlers on this land, it is our collective responsibility to pay respect and to recognize that this land is traditional territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nations, and we are here because this land was occupied. In recognizing that this land occupies colonized First Nations territories, and out of the respect for the rights of Indigenous people, it is our collective responsibility to honor, protect, and sustain this land. And we're hoping that everybody is going to be engaged today, engaged in some really good critical discussions about our history, but I sort of want to set the tone for the conversations that we're going to have. So it is our collective responsibility for creating an inclusive space for discussion and dialogue. All forms of discrimination and harassment will not be tolerated, nor will hate speech rooted in but not limited to anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Semitic, sexist, racist, classist, ableist, homophobic, and or transphobic sentiments and or remarks. We all have an obligation to ensure that an open and inclusive space free of hate is established. If you're not here in understanding in good faith, you may be asked to leave. All right, so looking forward to the event. Have a great day.
So I'd like to introduce Lynn Lavallee.
Welcome. Thank you for inviting me to this talk, Winnie. I appreciate it. I must apologize, though. I will have to leave early. There was another commitment that I made prior to knowing about this one, so I apologize for that. As was stated, I'm a professor here at Ryerson, but I'm Anishinaabe Métis, and when we introduce ourselves from the perspective of our ancestors. And my ancestors come from Temiskaming, which is Algonquin territory on my dad's side, and many generations came from that area. And in fact, it was a Métis settlement area that my family settled in Quebec in the 1700s, but were there well prior to the 1600s. My mom was born in Timmins. I was born in Sudbury, Ontario. My mom's mom was from Maniwaki, which is also Algonquin territory, and my grandfather was from Swan Lake in Manitoba, which is Ojibwe territory. So I come with a lot of different perspectives, and I'm going to focus my talk today about the Métis. So a lot of times when I teach in class and we talk about Aboriginal people, people will use the term First Nations because we hear that using the term Aboriginal is not quite as acceptable. So some of you have probably heard that before. There's hesitation to use the term Aboriginal because it lumps us all together. But when you just use one term, it excludes everybody else. So I find that I read a lot of documents and I'm in a lot of environments where people think that using the term First Nations is completely appropriate. And it is if you're talking about First Nations. But in doing so, you exclude Inuit and Métis. So our Constitution talks about 3 distinct groups within Aboriginal populations, and that's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So just be cognizant of that. And I do a lot of health research. And I look at research, and they'll talk to a group of perhaps First Nations people on reserve, because there's still a misperception out there that Aboriginal people only live on reserve. And in fact, in Canada, well, more than 50% live off reserve. So people will do research in a First Nations community on reserve, and then what they'll say is Aboriginal people have high rates of suicide. Aboriginal people have, live in overcrowded housing. Aboriginal people. So they'll make this inference to Aboriginal people, but they've only looked at a subsegment of the population. So with respect to health research and other research, question that. When you see the term Aboriginal, what do people really mean? Are they including the Inuit and are they including the Métis? So I have with me a Métis sash, and I'm Anishinaabe Métis. I am equally Anishinaabe, which means those are my roots. Anishinaabe people are Ojibwe people, Algonquin peoples, and that's who I am. I'm Anishinaabe. That's the culture that I carry. I'm also Métis. Métis is a very distinct peoples, originating from the 1600s when European men came and tended to marry First Nations women, and a distinct culture came out of that, a very distinct culture. And if you're Métis, you know what your culture is. Like sitting here, you know what your culture is. What kind of food do you eat? What kind of values does your family carry? You know what your culture is. Métis is a very specific culture. But we don't throw away our First Nations heritage either, right? So my Anishinaabe roots have helped stabilize me. My Métis roots have helped stabilize me. I don't ignore any of them. But initially, I was embarrassed to say I was Métis, right? I was embarrassed to say I was Métis in non-Aboriginal communities, and I was embarrassed to claim that I was Métis in Aboriginal communities. Because when you're Métis, you're not quite a person. Métis comes from the roots of mix, right? The mixing of First Nations women and European men. But again, it's a distinct society. We're not quite European, and we're not quite First Nations. And in fact, Marie Campbell talks about Métis being called the road allowance people because we literally lived on the side of the road. When the reserve system started in Canada, well before the Métis were established, Métis, because of the Indian Act, were not included on reserve. Right? We're not, Métis and Inuit for that matter, were not part of the Indian Act initially. They were excluded from that. So only status Indians were part of that Indian Act. And if you plan to do any work with Aboriginal people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, you really need to understand that Indian Act and recognize how that Indian Act defines our identity. How many people here can say an act, legislation, defines who you are? But it also divides us. The Indian Act divides us. So that's why I was ashamed to claim I was Métis when I was around First Nations people. I'm still Anishinaabe. I'm still who I am. I have those roots and they're deep. People look at me and they see that. If you know the culture, you know that. If you know my last name is equally First Nation status as well as Métis, right? So the embarrassment comes from the Indian Act. It doesn't come from the individual First Nations person who is telling me, you're a half-breed. You don't belong here. This is my house. I've had people say that to me, being at the Native Canadian Friendship Center. This is my house. You don't belong here. And I went off. I went completely off. I said, I belong here. She did not look more Métis, more Native than me. And when I say Native, that's my terminology that I'm using. It's kind of not a term that you should write in papers for your professors. You should stay politically correct, but we tend to use that term. So at the Native Canadian Center, this is what I dealt with. So being Native, Indian, Aboriginal, First Nations, Métis is not about the way you look either. There's a First Nations woman's status under the Indian Act, blonde hair, who wanted to use some facilities, and they were Aboriginal facilities, and she was told, this is only for Aboriginal people. And she had to pull out her status card to prove that. I have a card that tells you I'm Métis, right? Because the government forces us into that position. But we have to resist that. We have to resist the compartmentalization of us, our identity, with respect to the Indian Act. And the only way we can do that if we start breaking down the barriers internally within ourselves, right? But also, you guys sitting out there who may or may not be Aboriginal, right? Recognizing that there's extreme diversity. And in using the terminology that you use, you can sometimes be exclusionary and not knowingly. Because you might have been told, for instance, I understand that at one of the events, it's like, well, this is not Mississauga's the New Credit territory. It's also Iroquois territory. And you're going to get in that debate. And that's a political debate. We are constantly defined politically. Our lands are defined politically. Our identity is defined politically. Our children are defined politically. You can be a Bill C-31 or a Bill C-3, right? And I'm probably saying things you're like, what does that mean? That's our identity. Our identity is the legislation, which is extremely unfortunate. And your children will not be Indian. Or, tomorrow, I could be Indian, status Indian, on my grandfather's side, right? Because my grandfather was from Swan Lake. So technically, under the Indian Act, I qualify to be First Nations. My dad qualified to be First Nations, but you have to prove it to the government, right? But you're still who you are. Tomorrow, I'm not going to walk out the door and be someone else, right? So how many cultures can really say that? You know, that your identity is defined by the Indian Act. So just recognize that, right? Recognizing that. The other thing I wanted to mention with respect to Métis, there was a decision, a groundbreaking Supreme Court decision with respect to the Métis in January. Does anybody remember what that was? Nope. See? It doesn't resonate, right? So there was Daniels versus Canada. It was in January. And Henry Daniels brought forward a case for Métis and non-status people to say they are Indian under the Constitution. So the Constitution talks about Aboriginal people being First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. But the federal government has ignored Métis. They ignored Inuit as well, and then in the 1950s, Inuit were acknowledged, and now they're a fiduciary responsibility to the federal government. But Métis and non-status have never been. So Henry Daniels brought forth this case in 1999. He died in 2004, and it went to the Supreme Court it was decided in 2013. And the decision was that Métis and non-status are Indians under the Constitution, right? Which then has implications with respect to the federal fiduciary responsibility, right? So, and I see I'm speaking and it's kind of like, we're getting into a little bit too much detail, right? But in order to understand my identity, I have to get into that detail, which is extremely unfortunate, right? But I'm going to revert now. Do we have a time check? I just want to know for me.
Oh, thank you. 12:23.
12:23. Okay, perfect.
5 more minutes.
Okay, so what I want to close with, I know that Joanne Dallaire is doing a closing, but I wanted to, I brought my drum with me. I didn't know what I was going to really speak to. I knew I wanted to speak to with respect to the Métis and bring that forward. And just leave you with the thought, when you use the term Aboriginal, what do you mean? When you use the term First Nations, what do you mean? When you use the term Inuit, what do you mean? When you use the term Innu, what do you mean? When you use the term Métis, what do you mean? Further to that, when you use the term First Nation status, what do you mean? When you use the term First Nation non-status, what do you mean? When you use the term First Nation on reserve, what do you mean? When you use the term First Nation off reserve, what do you mean? When you use the term Métis registered, what do you mean? When you use the term Métis unregistered, what do you mean? So all of that talks about our identity. And it's overwhelming. It's very overwhelming. When I have my own family members who say, you call yourself that? You call yourself Métis? And I tell my cousin, I say, Leon, wait until you go. It was the opening of MétisRadio.fm. I said, when you go to this, you're going to see. I understand now why my dad and everybody danced the way they did. It's the Métis jig. I didn't know that growing up, but that was our culture. That's who we are, right? So when you use that terminology, when your professors are talking about this, correct people on it. Say, well, what do you mean? Who is the research done on? Who are these Aboriginal people? Does it then infer to all Aboriginal people, recognizing that there's huge diversity? So I brought my drum, and these are my roots. Equally Métis, equally Anishinaabe. For me, there's no difference, right? So what I want to do is just sing something. If anybody knows the song, please feel free to sing with me. So that song, I just need to tell you, invited our ancestors in. I didn't mean to sing that song, but sometimes if anybody's been a cultural singer, things just come sometimes. So that song was meant to invite the ancestors in. So I just wanted to leave you with that, and Hope the rest of the event goes well, and I really want to thank Winnie Ng for, taking on Social Justice Week every year, and it's always a phenomenal event. Students come and we see, diversity within all of the events that are happening, and I know how much work you put into this, and it's very challenging and it's fatiguing, and just the days, the hours that go into it prior to this week, let alone this week itself, right? So you deserve a very nice break on this long weekend, which I won't say is what holiday it is because it's just a long weekend.
I'd like to thank Lynn Lavallee for that. And as she said, there is a lot of issues with the name. For those of you who just came in, we did run out of food, but we are ordering more. So if you did not eat, we will be having some more pizza come.
It's a good problem.
Yes, it is a good problem. So more people came than expected. So when the food comes, I just ask that if you've already eaten, try to let those who haven't eaten go first. I'm now going to invite Mariam Zaidi. She is a graduate of the MFA Documentary Media Program here at Ryerson, and she has made a film. So there's been some critical acclaim to her film. It's called Safar, and it's an intimate documentary. It's personal. It's based on her personal experience. It's about her family members, most notably her sister, and how her family has tried to immigrate to Canada and came across numerous barriers. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of strict regulations on who can immigrate to Canada and who cannot. So she's going to be screening the film, and then she'll be discussing it. So I think you're going to be screening it first, right?
Sure.
Okay, so she's going to show the film first. It's about 20 minutes long, and then she's going to be talking about it, and she can answer some of your questions. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So you can come up, Mariam.
Hello. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Winnie, for organizing this. So as Alicia mentioned, this is a film I did in the MFA Documentary Media Program here at Ryerson. And it's a personal story about my family. I decided to do that as we're in the process of kind of figuring things out. I've applied for my residency, which I got recently, and my citizenship, and I started that process because I realized that my family couldn't migrate through the family application process with my sister who has special needs. And so now I'm trying an alternate route, which I talk about in the film. And that's basically what the film is about, my sister and my family. And my mother's actually here in the audience, sitting in the second row. So I'm really privileged to have her here for this screening.